Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are immersing ourselves in a really highly charged and, I have to say, extremely fascinating argument about modern media. We've got this compelling stack of sources in front of us, and they're asserting that what we're all watching isn't just entertainment. It's a massive cultural revision happening right under our noses, and it's centered on the most fundamental concepts we have of good.
That's absolutely right. And the core mission of this deep dive really is to unpack the source material's very detailed analysis of what they call the sympathetic villain phenomena. The sources claim that Hollywood has adopted a specific, a systematic template. They're taking these classic, unequivocally evil characters, think Maleficent, Cinderella, stepsisters, or someone like Cruella de Vil, and they're retroactively transforming them into these complex, misunderstood heroes, or victims of some kind of tragic circumstance.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because our sources are arguing that this shift is, well, it's way more than just a simple creative choice. They claim it's a coordinated, even a well-funded effort, and it's designed specifically to replace objective morality, which they frequently link traditional Christian ethics, with pure moral subjectivity. And this is aimed especially at media for children.
Exactly. So what we're going to do is examine the precise case studies the source material uses to illustrate this alleged full court press. We'll explore the difference between the, let's call it, the moral clarity you'd find in older films and the moral ambiguity that defines these modern retells.
So for you listening, the mission here is really to understand the mechanics of this argument. We're looking at what the source defines as an active campaign to convince a rising generation that, and this is their phrase, evil does not exist, and that every perceived villain is simply a victim of external factors.
Right. And to really get it, we need to start by understanding the macro context the source establishes before we can even dive into the individual film example.
Okay, let's do that. Let's start with the big. Because the source material doesn't argue this villain rewrite trend exists in a vacuum. No, it positions the cinematic trend within a much larger alleged cultural effort that's focused on historical and national revision.
The argument kicks off by claiming that the trend of making villains sympathetic is intrinsically linked to a broader, sustained effort to rewrite America's history itself. In this macro context, the United States is being recast by, cultural institutions as the ultimate international supervillain, a villain deserving of moral conduct.
And to ground this, this is a huge claim. To ground it, the source points to a specific piece of media that they use as the ultimate example of this historical revision. It's a massive multi-part documentary by Ken Burns about the River War. The source is clearly using some rhetorical exaggeration here, calling it a 25,000-hour production.
Well, yeah, that extreme figure, the 25,000-hour documentary, it serves a clear rhetorical purpose for the source. It's there to emphasize the sheer scale and the funding behind this alleged campaign of historical revision. The source claims that this specific documentary tells a flagrant lie, either explicitly or by implication, every 10 minutes or so.
Wow. Okay, so what is the ultimate goal of that narrative, according to this source's very charged critique?
The goal, they argue, is to convince younger viewers that the founding of the country was morally illegitimate. They claim the film falsely portrays America as being founded by racist misogynists who stole all their ideas from the Indians. That's a direct quote.
Right. And the source takes particular issue with how the documentary supposedly portrays indigenous leaders and thinkers.
They do. They use very strong, almost mocking language to critique the notion. They argue that the documentary tries to portray indigenous philosophers as being, quote, on the level of Plato or Aristotle in their intellectual contributions to the founding fathers. This is where the source uses some of its most provocative and, satirical language to attack that historical narrative.
And then the source delivers what it clearly intends as a scathing and very detailed rebuttal of that specific historical portrayal.
It does. They argue that when these indigenous peoples weren't busy with what the source describes as primitive activities, and again, these are their words, like converting human beings into stew or arranging beads into flamboyant patterns because they were too primitive to come up with a written language.
That is incredibly pointed.
It is. They go on to say that when they weren't doing that, they were supposedly giving Ben Franklin all of his ideas under the table. So we should be absolutely clear here. This is the source's specific interpretation, and it's delivered through very heavy satire. The intent is to delegitimize the idea that the revolutionary founders got their core philosophical ideas from indigenous sources. The source argues this is a deliberate distortion meant to erode national pride.
Okay, so this detailed focus on the distortion of American history, it serves as the foundation for the next phase of their art, the micro context.
Exactly. The logic, if powerful cultural institutions can successfully rewrite the historical narrative for adults and students, well, they can certainly rewrite individual morality for children.
So the source pivots directly from that massive historical critique to the most vulnerable audience, children's entertainment. And they define this as a highly coordinated and well-funded effort to propagandize children.
Right. The source asserts that this campaign is aimed at influencing children into believing that evil does not exist, and that any individual who appears to be evil is merely a misunderstood victim of circumstance. The primary mechanism for delivering this message, they argue, is rewriting those classic cultural touchstones, the films and the books that have defined generations of American youth.
So you can really see the alleged strategy clearly here. America becomes the new supervillain in the history book, and the individual classic cartoon villain becomes the new misunderstood victim. It's presented by the source as a unified, top-down strategy across different media forms, and it's designed explicitly to confuse young people about the existence of moral absolute. This setup is crucial for understanding why the film examples are so important to the source.
It is, because if the audience, especially a young audience, accepts the premise that all actions, even the most malicious, are traceable to systemic injustice or personal trauma, then the fundamental concept of personal moral responsibility, which the source links directly to traditional Western and Christian thought, is dissolved entirely. That dissolution, according to the source, is the main objective.
Okay, so with that foundation laid, let's zoom in on the primary case study the source uses to exemplify this, and that is Cruella de Vil, contrasting the 1961 animated classic 101 Dalmatians with the 2021 live-action film Cruella. The source holds up the original as, like, the gold standard of moral clarity.
They absolutely do. When analyzing the 1961 film, the source doesn't just discuss the plot. They focus on the specific moral vocabulary used to define Cruella. They point to the musical numbers sung by Roger, Cruella's nemesis, as the quintessential example of unequivocal moral judgment.
Right, I remember that song. It leaves absolutely zero room for interpretation or nuance. The source highlights some key phrases that define her evil as just, intrinsic, and absolute. If she doesn't scare you, no evil thing will. And that she's an inhuman beast who ought to be locked up and never released. He even calls her vermin, something that looks underneath a rock. I mean, it's brutal.
It is. And what's crucial, according to the source, is that the narrative of the original film relentlessly supports this extreme judgment. Cruella's motivation is purely malicious. She desires to steal and murder innocent puppies just to make a fur coat. The source emphasizes that she displays not a hint of humanity across the entire film's running. Just bad.
And you see this malice played out immediately in her famous entrance scene at Roger and Nita's modest home. She doesn't just disagree with them, she actively defiles their belongings and mocks their very... The source makes a point of analyzing her petty acts of malice, putting out her cigarette in Anita's baked good. In the muffin.
In the muffins, yes. And openly deriding their home as a hurried little house compared to her dream castle. Mm-hmm. She even insults Roger personally by calling him Sir Galahad, which is, a backhanded way of calling him a hopeless, naive fool.
So the source argues that these small, completely needless acts of cruelty are essential. They establish Cruella as fundamentally lacking in empathy or restraint.
That's the key. For a child in 1961, the lesson, according to the source, was clear and straightforward. Pure evil exists. Some people are malicious just for the sake of it. They have no redeeming qualities, and they must be definitively avoided or incarcerated. There's no suggestion that she needs therapy or, a better government system. She is simply wicked.
And the source tries to provide a cultural context for why this clarity existed back then.
They do. They suggest that the broader cultural context of 1961, which they define as the U.S. being a Christian nation, meant there was a widely shared cultural capacity for recognizing eternal damnation or inherent evil. This meant characters like Cruella don't deserve any of our sympathy. It was a settled question.
Okay, so that clear moral framework is the baseline. It's the yardstick the source uses to measure the radical transformation in the 2021 film, Cruella. The source argues this remake completely rewrites the character to reposition her as a tragic hero, delivering a message that is, philosophically opposed to the original.
Completely opposed. So instead of being born evil, she's given this elaborate, tragic origin story. The source describes this sequence in almost painful detail, even pausing to critique the technical quality of the film. They call the CGI unimaginative and boring, and the graphics comparable to a mall arcade in 2002 or a game on the original PlayStation.
So that critique of the technical artistry, that serves a purpose for the source, right? It's to suggest that the priority wasn't creative excellence, but ideological messaging.
That's their argument. The tragic origin involves young Cruella witnessing her mother's death, which is caused by Dalmatians right in front of her eye. This single moment immediately reframes her future malice toward dogs, not as pure, inexplicable evil, but as profound internalized emotional trauma. or even a phobia.
But the narrative complexity doesn't stop there. The source details a pretty significant plot that further muddies the moral waters.
Right. The twist is absolutely essential to the source's analysis. We discover the Dalmatians that attacked her mother were secretly ordered to do so via a dog whistle by another character, the ruthless Baroness. Then, in what they see as the ultimate revisionist move, the Baroness is revealed to be Cruella's actual biological mother. And the woman who was killed by the dogs, she was a maid or stepmother who was told to raise Cruella.
Wow, that is a huge shift. We've gone from woman wants to kill puppies for a coat to this deeply tangled web of revenge, mistaken identity, filicide by proxy, and deep-seated emotional scarring. This is what the source calls the trauma plus betrayal absolute formula.
Exactly. And this framework of complex trauma is used to completely justify Cruella's subsequent action. The new arc, as detailed by the source, involves Cruella plotting this elaborate revenge against the Baroness, which results in her biological mother's arrest. And the final beat is particularly striking to the source. Cruella gives Dalmatians away to friends as a gift because she has supposedly conquered her Dalmatian phobia.
So the original's primary villainous trait, her desire to exterminate the dog, is completely erased and reframed as a manageable psychological condition that resulted from external trauma.
Yes, and the source's conclusion regarding the moral implications is severe. They state that moral clarity, not to mention narrative clarity, is completely absent from the remake.
Because the simple message, don't be cruel to animals, don't be a malicious person, is replaced by total
It is. The source asks, what message does this send to children? Is the takeaway that your parent might be a secret murderer? Or is it that characters whose name literally translates to cruel devil are just misunderstood victims internalizing emotional trauma from freak accident? The core lesson is dissolved into this complex, relativistic understanding of motive, which makes it impossible to pass clear moral judgment. The evil isn't inherent anymore, it's inflicted.
And the source argues that this Cruella template, the villain rewrite, isn't an isolated incident. They see it as a consistent strategy applied across all genres of class, especially targeting young audience. It's part of what they call a decade-long pattern where the unequivocal antagonist is flipped into the hero.
That pattern is very visible in the next example the source provides, particularly recent, an upcoming Netflix animated film titled Steps, and this one takes aim at Cinderella's stepsister.
It's fascinating because Netflix's own marketing pitch seems to confirm the source's point. The pitch, which the source humorously suggests feels like it was produced by ChatT, directly challenges the original moral premise. It says, think you know Cinderella's evil stepsister, think again.
Right, and the plot outlined by the source dramatically inverts the classic narrative. The story centers on misunderstood Lilith, one of the stepsisters, who is blamed for hijacking a royal ball and accidentally turns her sister Margot into a frog. Lilith then has to team up with Cinderella, and this is a truly remarkable detail, a surprisingly dreamy troll to save the kingdom.
A dreamy troll. So the stepsisters aren't just given a softer exit, they are literally transformed into allies and protagonists. The source notes that the classic antagonist role is completely swapped out and given to a new figure.
A prince-obsessed mean girl, yes. Because, according to the source's cynical analysis, in modern remake, any female character with traditional goals, like, say, finding a prince, is now positioned as the new antagonist.
And the explicit theme of this movie, Steps, is what the source really focuses on.
It is. The film's stated goal is to prove that even so-called villains deserve a shot at happily ever after. So it's actively dismantling the moral lines established in the original tale, where the stepsister's entire role was to embody envy and petty cruelty.
The source is also extremely skeptical of the director's rationale that was provided in the pitch material. The director claimed the story was personal, noting that she, as an awkward, artsy Taiwanese kid in suburban New Jersey, often felt like an outsider and wanted to create a film for everyone who felt they didn't belong.
The source just dismisses this rationale as pathological narcissism. Their interpretation is that the director has internalized a narrative of victimhood and is now using this platform to erase the Cinderella story by projecting her own desire for acceptance onto the classic villain. The source argues the director's job here is not creation, but the destruction of a widely known moral template where the stepsisters were definitively bad people.
And to emphasize how radical this erasure, the source provides a really powerful reminding us of the moral severity. I mean, you're reminded of the 1950s Disney film where the stepsisters physically destroyed Cinderella's dress in assault. They showed active malice.
But the contrast really hits home when the source discusses the Grimm's 1800s version of the tale.
Yeah.
This classic version delivered a brutal, biblical Old Testament-style punishment to the stepsisters at Cinderella's wedding. The source recounts the gruesome detail. Doves fly down during the procession to strike the stepsisters' eyes blind, a painful fate they had to endure for the rest of their lives.
That historical context is so vital to the source's argument. The old fairy tales maintained that if you were terribly evil, then terrible things would happen. The moral ledger was balanced, often violent. Now the modern retelling says those same characters deserve to be misunderstood heroes teaming up with dreamy. That is a fundamental, almost philosophical.
And moving beyond Cinderella, The source notes the exact same formula was applied to another Disney classic, Maleficent from Sleeping Beauty. The original 1959 character is, she's the definition of pure, unmotivated evil. She curses a child to die because she was slighted, she wasn't invited to a party. Her motivation is petty envy and malice.
Right. And the live-action remake, Maleficent, changes everything by overlaying that essential lengthy backstory the source describes.
Exactly. The backstory reveals that the fairy was betrayed in some horrible way by the king. It gives her a legitimate, albeit extreme, reason for her rage. And when she shows up to place the curse, the source highlights a critical revision. The curse now includes an out. It stipulates it can only be lifted by true love's kiss. This introduces the possibility of redemption, which was completely absent in the original tale.
And ultimately, Maleficent herself comes to love the child and save the child's life, moving from active villain to protective hero.
It's the same architectural principle. Her evil is not inherent. It is a response to betrayal, which is then redeemed by circumstance and, a found family. The source argues that this template is being applied indiscriminately, even to works with what they call overt Christian and right-coded theme. And their specific example for this is Amazon's monumental series, The Rings of Power.
So this is interesting because it's a revisionist impulse crossing into high fantasy, particularly the work of J.R.R. Tolkien, who, as the source points out, deliberately portrayed orcs as the spiritual embodiment of evil.
Right. And yet the source notes that the showrunners chose to portray the orcs as sympathetic figures.
Which is a radical reinterpretation of established canon. And what was the showrunner's public rationale?
According to the source, it was that humanizing the orc armies provides better opportunities for storytelling. And, quite controversially, that this falls directly in line with Tolkien's writing. They suggested they were simply completing the moral portrait the original author intended, but, ran out of space to deliver.
So what does that look like in practice, this humanization of the orc?
The show proceeds to depict orcs not as mindless, homogeneous evil, but as brutal but oppressed foot soldiers. The source notes they are now concerned with achieving a future where their families can exist as more than tools for Lord Sauron. This turns a force of nature, pure malignancy, into an army of environmental and political victims.
And the source quotes specific dialogue to illustrate this startling shift in characterization.
They do. They point to an orc named Glug lamenting, "The preparations are nearly complete, Lord Father, but we are safe here. We have a home. Must we go to war again? You told me Sauron was dead. Let us leave him that way."
Wow. That does not sound like a classic Tolkien orc.
The source views this dialogue as jarring, arguing that it pulls the viewer out of the world the author created and shoehorning all of the most cliched scenes imaginable into the plot. They interpret this specific exchange as portraying the orcs as fundamentally anti-war hip who are reluctant participants in Sauron's global conflict. And this entirely undermines the clear moral cosmology of the original text. The artistic tension that might be gained by humanizing them is, in the source's view, totally negated by the fundamental undermining of the story's moral state.
We do have to pause here and acknowledge something important. This revisionist approach, it's commercially viable. The source does not dismiss this trend as mere artistic failure. It concedes that this formula of sympathetic villainy has been very commercially successful.
And the prime example they cite to illustrate this commercial success is Wicked, the prequel to The Wizard of Oz, which the source calls one of the biggest box office hits of the decade. It made the Wicked Witch of the West sympathetic, arguing her villainy was the product of misunderstanding and circumstance.
Right. And beyond the commercial success, the source focuses heavily on the explicit and, as they call it, transparent political messaging embedded within Wicked. They cite that central rhetorical question that guides the whole production. Are people born wicked, or do they have wickedness thrust upon them?
That question is absolutely key to the source's analysis because it frames wickedness as an external imposition, not an internal character failure. If wickedness is thrust upon you, then personal responsibility is significantly diminished and the blame shifts outward to the system or the environment.
And the source interprets the political messaging of Wicked as an argument that wickedness is not a legitimate concept at all, but rather it's a way to scapegoat minorities or those on the periphery. The argument is made that if you can convince people that the Wicked Witch wasn't truly bad, well, then you can convince them that nobody bad.
And the source uses a very strong real-world analogy to detail this political interpretation. They suggest the message is functionally identical to arguing that crime in certain areas, say the south side of Chicago, is not due to wicked people making poor choices, but rather because the government is scapegoating poor people. When the source believes the narrative successfully substitutes systemic injustice for internal moral failing.
And this substitution is easily absorbed, according to the source, because the target audience is so young. If you're 10 years old, which is a key demographic for this kind of entertainment, you're not very discerning when you're watching these messages, but you'll fall for it. And you'll internalize the belief that external factors always negate.
This analysis leads directly to the source's definition of the ultimate goal of moral subjectivity. They define the entire phenomenon from Cruella to Wicked as a full-court press designed to systematically convince children that objective morality does not exist, and that any traditional system, such as Christian ethics, is merely a simplistic, outdated approach.
The source's conclusion, therefore, is pretty stark and uncompromised. They believe that those creating these narratives ultimately want youth to believe that evil is not a legitimate concept, precisely so that they can be indoctrinated in supporting and committing acts of evil without the moral framework to condemn them. The cultural programming, in their view, is intentional and direct.
And this is where we see the source connecting the micro-narrative revision, changing a single film's plot, to the macro-cultural goal, the goal of erasing the moral concept of intrinsic evil. If every act of cruelty is excused by a tragic past, the idea of personal choice in moral matters becomes, well, almost irrelevant.
This line of thinking leads the source to ask a deeply provocative question. If the motivation for these retcons is purely, if it's just about seeking new content by inverting moral role, why does the revisionist trend only move in one direction, from evil to good? Why are there no right-wing retcons of classic stories?
It's a very compelling rhetorical point. The source uses Gaston from Beauty and the Beast as their sarcastic example of a character who would never get a sympathetic remake. They joke about a massive animated film called Gaston, where he is vindicated as the true hero.
Right, and the source attempts to construct Gaston's defense. All he did was work out, eat eggs every day, defend the town, and a vulnerable woman from a rampaging end. The source emphasizes that Gaston is depicted as taking pride in himself and his community, and is identified as a normal white guy.
Exactly. And the source argues that Gaston is exempt from this redemption form. He will never get a sympathetic origin story because he embodies values that Hollywood abhors. They claim Hollywood is not interested in vindicating characters who stand for traditional concepts of self-sufficiency, fitness, physical strength, and community defense. They see those characteristics in a modern context as inherently toxic.
And this distinction solidifies the source's very specific definition of the modern villain archetype in contemporary narrative. They claim that in today's story, no individual can be truly described as evil unless he is a straight white.
That's their explicit claim, that figures matching this profile are the only villains that can remain unequivocally bad. All other characters, particularly if they are part of a, quote, marginalized group, must be protected from villain status and reframed as victims of circumstance through this sympathetic rewrite mechanism. The removal of the ability to assign blame to anyone outside a narrow demographic is, according to the source, central to the whole project of moral subjectivity.
This analysis requires the source to explicitly distinguish this trend from that earlier wave of popular anti-heroes, which were huge hits on television, shows like Breaking Bad and The Sopranos.
They do. The source establishes three key differences to argue that the modern Disney and Netflix remakes are fundamentally different and, in their view, more insidious than the anti-hero trend. First, and most simply, anti-hero shows are explicitly not aimed at children. The moral ambiguity is intended for mature audiences who are capable of wrestling with complex ethical choices.
Okay, that's a clear difference. What's the second one?
Secondly, the source argues that anti-hero shows are often artistically superior. They're original concepts that maintain high stakes and genuine tension. Characters like Tony Soprano or Walter White commit horrific acts, and the audience is rarely asked to absolve them completely. Rather, you're forced to confront the character's internal moral struggle.
And the third and most important difference, according to the source,
it's that the modern remakes are not original artistry. They are transparent attempts to rewrite our culture and reprogram the morality of an entire generation. By giving the classic villain a simple, tragic excuse, the emotional and moral stakes are entirely removed from the story, leaving behind only the ideological message.
Finally, the source attempts to connect this cultural shift directly to real-world reflection, to significant societal concepts. They argue that the entertainment culture is both reflecting and driving practical changes in how society morality guilt.
Yes, and this connection is drawn via the judicial system. The source discusses the issue of violent criminals being repeatedly released from jail or receiving insufficient sentences from judges. The source uses very charged language here, claiming these judges, who they suggest are almost always female, want to see the good in this evil scumbag and insist on giving them multiple chances, regardless of the danger to the public.
Now, we need to emphasize something here. The source is not claiming that these judges watched the Cruella remake and were then subsequently influenced policy. That's not the argument.
No, not at all. Instead, the source argues that both phenomena the sympathetic villain narrative in media, and the reluctance of the judicial system to impose harsh judgment are expressions of the same underlying cultural paradigm shift.
So a shared paradigm shift.
That is the absolute key. A cultural rejection of inherent guilt or personal responsibility in favor of systemic causation. If the entertainment industry is constantly feeding the public the message that no one is truly wicked, only victimized by circumstance, then it should surprise no one, in the source's view, that judicial figures operating within that same culture exhibit extreme lenience. They're driven by the desire to find the misunderstood victim hiding inside the violent offender. The source argues the cultural output and the judicial outcome are merely two sides of the same ideological coin.
We've just concluded a really powerful deep dive into the source material's argument that modern entertainment is engaged in a concerted effort to blur the fundamental lines between good and evil, specifically targeting younger audiences. We watched how classic pure villains from Cruella, who displayed pure petty malice to the stepsisters who earned severe biblical punishment, are systematically transformed into victims of tragic past.
And the source's final message really summarizes the stakes involved. They believe those with billions of dollars and control of the entertainment industry benefit immensely when a generation is raised to believe that morality is entirely subjective and that objective evil is a myth. If the concept of inherent, unredeemable wickedness is erased, the cultural framework necessary to identify and combat genuine maliciousness is lost. The source advises parents who are concerned about this message to actively seek out and show their children the older film from the 1950s and 60s, where good and evil were distinctly and unequivocally defined.
It's an incredibly provocative stack of sources, and it leaves you with a serious thought to consider long after this deep dive ends. If the ultimate goal of these narrative rewrites erase the concept of objective evil by systematically giving every villain a tragic path, what does that ultimately do to the concept of heroism? If no one is truly wicked, if all cruelty is excusable through circumstance or trauma, is anyone truly good? And what kind of morally significant stories can we possibly tell?